This is an opportunity for all of us to start this conversation. It's an important conversation, and our guest speaker is here with us. He is Dr. McEdward Murimbika. He's an entrepreneur in his own right, and he's also a senior lecturer at the Vets Business School in one of the programs called Entrepreneurship and New Venture Creation. And this afternoon from GCI, Global Change Investors, we have invited him, particularly in the times that we find ourselves in, where the whole world is in a pandemic, and what everyone is thinking of, it's either panic or fear, and many people are even asking themselves, what is going to happen post this pandemic? If this pandemic period continue for the next 12, 18, 2 years, where will people be? And that's the reason we had to say from the cooperative movement, what is the basis of cooperative enterprise confidence in collective actions, even in crisis times? And there was no better person who could speak to this topic, possibly the ones I know better than Dr. McEdward Murimbika. I may not have done justice to his introduction, but as he takes over now, I'll ask him to first introduce himself well, and then he can then do the presentation as expected. We are going to have him talking for about 40, 45 minutes. Thereafter, the rules are as follows. Zoom allows you to raise a hand, then you'll raise a hand and be recognized. Once you are recognized, you'll be given an opportunity to ask questions. The public chat is also open. You can also, as and when you'll be presenting, if you have got questions, you can raise those questions in the public chat so that you do not forget your questions. Let me also tell you, we are streaming live to Global Change Investors GCI Facebook page. Those that might not be able to connect on Zoom, they can also join there. It's an opportunity that I think in the cooperative movement this afternoon, we are honored to have Dr. Murimbika in our midst. And without waste much time, I hand over this time to him. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Brian. I must start by apologizing that I know that you had invited me earlier on to come, and I'd made a commitment that I would come and speak to your group. But unfortunately, my schedule kept on changing because the university, the school where I'm teaching, they did not close because of COVID. What they simply did was to shift our programs online. So everything moved there, and my schedule was very fluid. But I'm glad now, finally, I could make time and come and join you, and so that we could have this discussion. If you'd indulge me, let me share my screen so that I could be able to go through the PowerPoint presentation to lead up into the talk. Step one, let's see on that. The system asks me if I could share. Have you given me the power to share?
Yes, yes. Let's do that. I think you have, I had forgotten. Yeah, you should have them now.
I should have, okay.
Yes, my apologies.
All right. Fair on that. And I was wondering why you decided to give me a burden of such a complex topic. And
No, it's not. It's not such a dead and dog. It's just a challenge. You look at where we are in the continent, and you begin to ask yourself, what will it take for the continent to begin
Right,
to take whatever endowments that we have collectively for our own benefits. And then this is where we find ourselves in
yeah,
cooperative enterprises, confidence in collective actions. Can we
right,
cooperate? Can we work together? What is the extent to which that can help us take some mileage in what we already have in our midst?
right. Well, I decided that in order to utilize the brief time we have to the maximum, I would focus on contextualizing cooperative enterprising and the value of collective action, particularly within the fluid global circumstances and global environment. So I break down the themes I would cover. I want to look up at the context of the modern socioeconomic drivers because you were thinking and formulating this discussion on the basis of crisis, but specifically focusing on the current crisis we are going through, the COVID pandemic. Then I asked the question, why is there a need to cooperate? Because human beings, we have a tendency that when we're in crisis, it's one woman or one man for himself. And because of that, so why should we cooperate when we're in crisis mode? Instead of serving ourselves, even our laws even assist in saying when you're in crisis, first of all, you have to save your life first before you save the others. And for those who have been flying, you know, that's even that they publicize it. They tell you that before you put your own mask, before you save someone else by giving them a mask, first put yourself. So in crisis time, we're expected to look after ourselves before we look after others. So why would we then cooperate? And I end the brief discussion by looking up at exponential group thinking. What is the value in group thinking when we are in such a situation? So to move on, when we think of global trends, a lot of things comes to mind. And I decided to look up at, collectively look up at four themes, which normally gives us the status on how society today, from a socioeconomic perspective, is being driven and how we are responding and behaving within that context. One of the major things which no one who is today alive can escape is the concept of digitization. Digitalization is a process where we are seeing services, products, and all ways of doing things, methods, processes. They are going on digital platforms. And in so doing, when a digital platform or a digitalization of a product or of a system is done, normally it leads to, first of all, it leads to deception. Those who are in that space which is being digitized, they have a tendency of thinking that, oh, well, this is it's fashion, it's something which will pass. Because as in fashion, it comes up with season and it passes. But the challenge we face in this context is most of us are being deceived to think that we're going to go back to some form of normality. And yet, if I ask a lot of us, what is normal today? We hardly come up with a unified definition. That's where the deception sits in. This deception also leads to, eventually, it will lead to disruption. Disruption only happens when the change becomes permanent. And those who are not prepared for it becomes victim of it. And the easiest example is what's happening within the technology space. And this is where also the place which you as a group are participating, looking up at the disruptions which are happening within the financial sector, which are happening within the economic planning sphere. It is those who were deceived to believe that we're going to go to some form of normal, and yet we cannot define what is normal. And then disruption comes in. And disruption, unfortunately, most of the time we hear it being used and being thrown all over by a lot of people, meaning any business which does very well, it has led to disruption. But disruption in essence is something where a high quality service, product, or a system is introduced at the lowest end of the community or society. And that becomes the norm, which forces even those who are sitting at the top, probably paying a higher price, realizing that they're overpaying, then they come down. That's where disruption happens. Disruption doesn't happen when you sell an expensive product to people who are already buying expensive products or who are buying expensive services. Disruption happens when you come up with an innovation which solves a problem at the bottom of the pyramid, forcing those who are at the top of the pyramid to come down for better services and quality service. That's where disruption happens, because it means you free a lot of resources which have been tied up at the top for overpricing and all that, and bring it down. When that happens, it also leads to another phenomenon which you see globally, which is demonetization. And the easier way of thinking of demonetization is to look at things we used to pay for. A decade ago, there are a lot of things we used to pay for, and today we don't pay for them, because such sectors and such services have been demonetized because the disruption has succeeded. If we take, for example, the current meeting we're in, normally to have these kind of meetings, you would need a lot of logistics. We would have required a venue, would have required transport, we would have required all these items, would have required costs. But now we can have exactly the same meeting, minus physical presence to each other, but achieve the same goals with paying far less. And all the other things we could have paid for in so doing, we're not paying. That is an example of demonetization. Sectors are being demonetized because they've been disrupted effectively, which also means when demonetization happens, you experience dematerialization. Now I can come to you without having to get in a car, or you can come to me without having to drive to a car. We no longer need the material transport in order for us to reach each other and to get to each other. That's an exercise that's a process of dematerialization. The car is value in this instance, in this current interaction we're having, have been dematerialized. You see these examples in many places. Books, we used to buy a lot of books. Music, we used to go and buy music we go to the music shops and pick up CDs and look at them. Before that was tapes, before that CDs and all those things. But today we don't, right? What has happened is dematerialization leads to democratization, which means more people. In this session, you can keep on admitting more people, and the capacity can be expanded, where you can have thousands of people attending a single meeting, which if we say let's do it physically, it becomes impossible or too expensive. So we've removed money, we've removed material, and we've introduced democracy, which means collectively, we can have this open market for ideas in meetings like these. These are global trends which are happening, and half the time, a lot of us, we don't pay attention to them. We know that they're existing, but we don't pay much attention, or we think they're happening somewhere else when we're observers. And that's where the deception comes in, which is critical when you think of the second point, which I listed there. Why is it important in this context to talk of things like cooperatives? Because I've spent a lot of time having discussions with colleagues in the business, in entrepreneurship, and colleagues in business and thinkers within the business schools who believe that cooperatives are a defunct business model. And yet, in reality, every business you look at serves the same purpose. It serves the interest of its founders. It serves the interest of its stakeholders. And when we look up at a cooperative, all of those models we have today of businesses were built from a traditional cooperative. Capitalism is based, it's a derivative of cooperatives. And we tend to also make a huge mistake. The way we are deceived by all these disruptions, we are also confused when we start thinking about cooperatives and cooperation. We think it's communism, and therefore it's bad. And you'd hear a lot of bad names attached to cooperatives on that basis that it's communism or it's socialism. It has nothing to do with communism. It has nothing to do with socialism, because throughout sociocultural development, human beings have consistently gone back to cooperate. And even in prehistory, to hunt, to gather, It's all about cooperation. You couldn't hunt effectively, or you couldn't hunt even big games if you are on your own. Cooperation has always the basis upon which human society has evolved and developed. So there's this misnomer that cooperatives and thinking cooperatively means we are communistic. It's misaligned. Today, all the business models we follow derive from the same concept, that you need to look up at the socio-economic welfare of the stakeholders. And in this case, when you look up at other forms of businesses, their survival or they're structured along where you build high walls and exclude others. Yet cooperatives take a different alignment, where if you think of, if they were defunct, you wouldn't think that you'd expect to find them in some of the most advanced economies in the world. If you take the biggest economy pre-COVID, we'll see what happens after COVID. The biggest economy on earth today is the United States. And the United States, 50% of Americans are members of a cooperative or beneficiary of a cooperative. The same you would find to countries like Germany. You'll find in half of European Union, 50% of their citizens are members of a cooperative or direct beneficiaries of a cooperative. So this tells you something, that even the most advanced economies which we look to, or which we aspire to reach at some point, use cooperatives as models. So instead of looking up and dwelling on debating whether they are functional or important, there's no doubt cooperatives are a powerful economic model, and they're a powerful way of bringing socioeconomic development. And they've been formalized in some of these advanced economies for centuries now. And they have survived and remain so. It's not by coincidence that you would look at more than half of the world's most advanced, the capitalistic economy. Half of its population are dependent on cooperatives, and they operate their local economic affairs through cooperatives. So that debate of saying, no, cooperatives, do they work or should they, is neither here nor there. But what is basis then would we seek to cooperate? It should be more than economic. It has to include your social development. It has to include, even for others, things like political benefits. Political benefits is not about being elected into office. Political benefits is about leadership. Political benefit is about ability to organize a community or a society towards a particular goal, be it economic or social. Therefore, you would find that if one goes back and look back, the context is cooperatives have always been a response. They've been applied as a response towards economic stress or social upheaval. Throughout history, they have been used in response. Countries which have created solid economic development have always used the models of cooperatives as a recovery tool and as a recovery system. Because when economic stress sets in a community or a society, it affects everyone else. And if everyone is equally affected, the chances of cooperating and coming together to seek common ground are higher than when everything else is fine and everyone is sitting up in their corners. So economic stress and social upheaval are serious drivers to seek cooperation within any given space and context. Then one would ask the question today, if we look immediately, we say, oh, but we've got economic crisis. We are currently under COVID, and it is decimating economies, not just South African. It's decimating economies, and its effect and consequences has not yet been captured. And we are also going through social upheaval. We're changing the way we live. We're being forced into social distance, which is contrary to what human beings is all about. All these would qualify that probably this is the perspective we must focus on as a basis to argue for more cooperation. But then I would ask another question now. Was there any economic or social stability in pre-COVID era in South Africa? And this, be it rhetoric or a direct question, then it forces us to go back. Let's look up at pre-January. Was South Africans, majority of us, in economic and social stability? Were we? If we were, how come even then majority of South Africans have been economic minority? They do not participate in the economy. This is the conundrum I call majority economic minority. Highest number, 85% of South Africans are excluded from the economy of this country. When you have a country of less than of 58 million people, and 17 million of those depend on the state for social welfare, that's a crisis. It simply means you had a large population which had already been excluded. So the economic stress and social upheaval within this country not started with COVID. But we use this as, okay, arguably this is unprecedented. But the fact that you actually have the majority of the country not being economically active, you've got the youth, people who are under 35, 53% of them unemployed, and the number is going to grow. You've got a substantial number of the youth, more than 40%, who have never worked since they turned 18. That's a crisis. But at no point did we treat it as a crisis. We talk about it in parliament, we talk about it within social setups. Oh, the country is going through this, the country is going through that. But we have never been urgent, as we are now looking up at COVID, as if COVID in itself has created an unprecedented consequence. In reality, the country has been in serious economic stress and social upheaval prior to this point, although we might use it as an unprecedented event. So then, if we use it as an event, what then should we do beyond it? If history tells us that crisis points are the best positions to start cooperating, how will we do that? And yet, arguably, we definitely have been in social exclusion. We've had continuation. The real crisis this country, or the real crisis this group should be focused on, is what do we do beyond COVID? That's where our crisis begins. Because this core condition of COVID has been created externally, imported, but when the solution is found, will that mean things will go to normal? What is normal? If things go back to normal, it means we will continue with exclusion from participation in economic and social democracy, which the current society and country promises. That's where our way of thinking what is a crisis and how should we respond should change. Then the focus must always be, shouldn't we be saying, whilst we are in lockdown and whilst we are thinking of how we're going to reopen the economy, we're not going to reopen the economy. We should be thinking of how are we going to actually increase participation within this economy. That's where the concepts of cooperating, the questions of how do we cooperate comes into play. And I put the biblical quote from the Ephesians, where Paul was talking about the struggle not being about flesh and such, but focus on authorities and forces of darkness, and which leads to spiritual wickedness. There is no worse form of wickedness than dehumanizing human beings in a context where we normalize the current economic exclusion. That there is no worse form of spiritual wickedness, which goes beyond us accepting that we can have 80% of our population excluded from participating in the basic socio-economic structure. That should be the focus of our economic stress and social upheaval. If we look that and translate that into our current situation, we cannot talk about, no, we need to go back to the normal. There was no normal, right? Because even if we go back to pre-January to 2020, we still do not have a sustainable way of looking or managing the economy post the pandemic. And how do we include majority to participate in? That's where the whole issue now comes in and said, probably, I would argue that we need a new response. We need an alternative way of looking at how do we bring in majority to participate, rather than continue with what we have always continued with. We've tried liberal economics, we've tried neo-liberal economics, all these for a decade and a half now, since the dawn of democracy. We have not made any significant progress. It seems what we've managed to do is to get more people to be participating in eating the cake which has been there, without necessarily making more bakers, without necessarily backing up alternatives of cakes and all that. So giving everyone a piece of the cake is not the solution here, because the cake just keeps on getting smaller and smaller, and yet more people sink into socio-economic poverty. And that's more wicked than any form of disempowerment we can think of. Therefore, I came up and proposed probably that there should be an efficient way of effectively cooperating, and by observing 7 principles. And these 7 principles, if you create a cooperative of any form, and if you cannot define these 7 principles, you are not effectively cooperating. And you're also laying up a foundation where you would have socioeconomic exclusion within the membership. First of all, cooperatives are based on the principle of voluntary and open membership. Voluntary and open membership is non-negotiable when it comes up to cooperatives, which means those members who identify what is the problem we want to solve have the burden to convince others and recruit them to actually agree and identify this is a problem which we need to solve. And the power there and the question, the issue there is voluntary. So it goes back to the other question where when you speak to colleagues about cooperatives, cooperatives are communistic and all that. And right there, you see the difference. You are looking up at open membership on the basis of common identity and problem. And there is a principle of democratic membership and control. So it could not be, if we think of all the socialistic and we think of all the communistic societies, we don't talk of democratic membership control. You talk of centralized control, which happens most of the time in other business forms. If you look up at a big corporate, which is listed up on the JSE, who controls it? They call it a public company. They call it a public listed company, but is it really public? You can buy shares, but you will never be the majority. And who are the majority? Majority are actually the minority who controls that entity, what it does, and who benefits from it. Which is why half of the time when you look up at some of the crises we face in the country, things like when big corporations, CEOs meet and decide to collude. We've seen it happening in the bread cartel. We've seen it happening in the construction industry and several other companies, school uniforms and all that. They sit and decide that and they cooperate in taking value from society, redirecting value from society. Then we call that public companies and we call them, but are they really public? To the contrary, cooperatives actually drive from the opposite of what you find in such public listed companies. And yet, the public narration will tell you that cooperatives are a defunct business model. I would argue that a cooperative should also focus on point number 3, which is member economic participation. This is critical. Recruiting members and bringing them to be participants in a cooperative or just members of a cooperative without empowering them to participate effectively is not a good approach. That in itself is not a sustainable basis of cooperative solution. You would need members to economically participate in all the levels which you decide would make that organization sustainable. Without economic participation, you're just recruiting people to be members in a lot of organizations we think are democratic and the decisions is made by a few. Then look up also to defend autonomy and independence. Membership, autonomy, and independence should be defended fiercely, but you don't find this in any other form of business because autonomy and independence is based on those who would raise capital and buy control of those organizations. And you find this in the opposite of a corporation will be of cooperative will be corporations listed up on the JSE, which are considered public companies. And there's nothing public about them. There is no autonomy there, no independence. The independence is the independence from government and regulation and independence from society. And yet cooperatives seek autonomy and independence to protect and defend the interests and goals of what they actually intend to why they were created. Then I would argue that things like education and training and information dissemination should be critical and primary to any effective mobilization of cooperation within a cooperative. Education, training, and information. Information is not just power in this context, but the form at which we are creating information and the speed at which we are generating information is so exponential to a point where If we have membership which just waits to come up for cooperative meetings and they're not effectively participating in the day-to-day affairs of the organization, it means they're falling behind, and therefore it means we are technically, socio and economically disempowering them by reducing their participation and not passing on the information and knowledge. This is one of those trends where people would think that because information is readily available, therefore it's democratically accessed. Problem. If you think of Google as an example, everyone thinks that you can go to Google and find an answer. But have you noted that every time you search something on Google, it will give you millions of responses? And if you ask, how many of us go to page 10 of Google search? How many of us even go to page 5 when Google gives you those millions of answers? Who goes to answer number 704? Who goes there? Then we think that, oh, because we got answers. You are not getting answers on Google. You're not getting information on Google. What you're getting is whatever has been read by more people is what you're getting, because that's what the system is designed to do. It ranks those things which have been used by more people. And unfortunately, we end up using information and answers to problems which are being created elsewhere and not suitable for our context. That's why we even think that our economic models should follow the West. Our economic models should be based on United States or England. And yet in reality, it doesn't make sense. We should not be modeling our economic participation through those kind of principles because they are flawed. England is what it is today through hundreds of years of colonialism, right? United States is the superpower it is today because it is a military complex. So who are we going to be colonizing, or who are we going to enslave for 400 years so that we can benefit from free labor like the United States did? Which means everything, information, education, and training becomes critical so that we are all on the same page and understand what is it that economic participation is all about. Then cooperation among cooperatives becomes another important element, which means you also have a responsibility as a cooperative to look to cooperate with other cooperatives who may be of benefit to you, or you might partner with to solve common problems. Once you start doing that, you start creating a network of cooperatives which solve real community problems on the basis of democratic membership and challenges, and focus on problems driven by the communities which are sitting up in those problems. Which now brings the last principle, which is concern for community. A cooperative which do not have a clear definition of what they are concerned for community is not a cooperative, because cooperatives are driven as a response to social challenges, as a response to a social upheaval. So if you do not have a clear definition of what you would want to do, you are not building effective community of participation within the cooperative. Effective participation brings in one of the lessons I would want to focus on, which is called network effect. We are all members of social groups, social networks, and we know what a social network is. But how many of us have actually thought how that would work as a business model, or how that works as a business model? We go on WhatsApp. We don't pay to use WhatsApp. Have we ever asked ourselves, why are we using such a fantastic short messaging system and we don't pay? Why is it that we don't pay? Because we are the products which WhatsApp is selling. We go there, we join. The more people who join and use WhatsApp, the more data WhatsApp has to sell to Facebook. That's why Facebook went. For years, they had WhatsApp as a business. No one was paying for it until Facebook bought it. Why? Because we, the users, are the products. That's what's called the network effect. Cooperatives are sitting up in a position where once you identify a focus, we want to go in the financial sector as a cooperative. We're going to deal with insurance. We're going to deal with banking. We're going to deal with loan. We're going to deal with business funding, venture capital loan. You define those because these are problems you have identified in a community you're targeting. The best way of looking at it is to think of a telephone. A telephone is useless if you buy a telephone and you don't have people to call. And yet, it works more when you buy a telephone and you got more people to call. You start telling people to buy their phone so that you can call them. And the network keeps on expanding. It starts with one individual, and the more people who join in, that network becomes stronger. this is the business model which is used by all these social media companies. And you're now seeing it going into your biggest corporations, which are your top 100 Bloombergs and all that. Any business which is failing to build the network effect, its future is limited. So in order to benefit effectively, cooperatives and the kind of entities we would need to create under these conditions should take the value of network effect. Because a cooperative deals with real problems within community and within society. And because of that, it's easier to be effective and to be exponential in your enterprising model business. And forget about all the challenges where you have got naysayers who would argue that, look, no, cooperatives are a socialistic perspective. It's all if and they are a defunct model. To the contrary, if they were a defunct model, countries like your Germany and all that would not have recovered from the Second World War after being decimated and losing that war. That's why majority, 57% of Germans are members of cooperatives and use effectively cooperatives. So any society which is stable and able to recover from a crisis and all uses effective cooperation. But for South Africa, effective cooperation would mean we need to be more aggressive and exponential and be enterprising in the way we think of what problems do we want to solve with this particular cooperative. What is it that we know very well that even under the apartheid era, what we consider commercial agriculture today was a product of cooperatives, right? And this was the foundation of the Union of South Africa. Cooperatives were the foundation of the Union of South Africa. Before even the Union of South Africa was signed in 1910, the other side of the losing side of the war were the Afrikaners. They made a decision and demanded that a land bank be created before they signed that agreement. That's why most of the institutional structures like the land bank and all, they predate the Union of South Africa. They were part and parcel of that argument and that debate from 1902 when that war ended up to 1910 when the whole agreement was signed, which then excluded the majority of. So we will be naive that the exclusion of the majority of South Africans from participation in the economy is a coincidental issue or is just a byproduct of colonialism or apartheid. It goes deeper to structures and institutions. Whilst we've got good laws in terms of cooperatives, but their application and use is still a bigger problem. That's where the possibility comes in. Because we sit closer to society and community, we have responsibility to continuously educate ourselves so that we address real challenges of the people. Beyond, even we take this example, we say, no, COVID is a problem. We know that. But the question we ask ourselves, were we that powerful before COVID? The answers will still no. We still had a problem. Which means we must use this as a landmark, but the decisions we must make must address problems we have faced prior to coming up to this position. And there's so much research and data available on figuring out what is the effectiveness of cooperative in different sectors. And even your McKinsey's have done studies with some of these institutions and all, and the results always come back that there is no difference between a corporation and a cooperative which is managed as an enterprise. That's the difference. A cooperative which is managed as an enterprise participates and performs in some sectors, even outperforms corporations which are listed on the basis that such members drive their interest and they would guard their interest jealously and will do everything to make sure that we succeed. But if a cooperative is managed as public goods like government, then that's where the challenge comes. The fact that every member has participation capacity doesn't necessarily mean that we are all equal in terms of capacity to manage affairs and to manage our interest. That differentiation of saying treating a cooperative as an enterprise rather than as public goods makes a huge difference. That's the basis upon which we can start building new cooperatives, which creates network effects, recruiting more people to join in because they want to solve the problems which they are actually experiencing. That's where my thinking and my approach to how to center stage cooperatives. I'm looking at what is our actuality and what are the possibilities. I'm thinking that the possibilities we have such a tiny little population of cooperatives, particularly among the economically excluded. We can increase that number. Can you imagine if we start reaching the numbers of 25, 30, 40, 50% of the economically excluded now becoming participant through corporations in different sectors and cooperation between cooperatives, that we start creating an economic effect. That's where the possibilities would be. And I would urge you that to think of it, see the world what could be, not how it is. Because how it is today, we are focused on an event which will pass. And yet prior to that event, we're still in serious challenge, which requires us to have some form of cognitive enhancement and thinking. And I would want to end there so that we can have more, we can discuss and look up at those basic principles, which I believe should be drivers of exponential planning in terms of cooperatives and center staging cooperatives as socio-economic development solutions, driven by the people who are experiencing these challenges, as opposed to thinking that we can borrow models elsewhere and bring them in our context and they'll solve a problem. All right. I would give back to you, Pastor.
Yes, Doc. Hey, you have raised so many issues here, and one is thinking, where do we start? Yeah. But it's not for me to ask all those questions, but thank you for coming and raising all these critical challenges. And I think as we were all listening, many of us had questions, possibly as others are trying to reframe or frame their questions. One will ask this question and begin to ask those that want to raise their hands to start raising their hands. Why is there such a lack of, or why have cooperatives in particular in the South African context failed to take off and drive that member economic participation, as you talked to in the 7 principles, in an environment of South Africa being, the most industrialized country in the continent of Africa. And then you have other countries in Africa that have got very strong cooperatives movement or cooperative enterprises. The likes of Kenya, even Swaziland next door to us here, is very strong, having strong cooperative enterprises. I'm raising this one as a starter, waiting for others to start raising their hand, because everyone now can unmute themselves and begin to raise these questions. As you are answering, Doc, I will be expecting hands to be lifted up high. And also, I think the public chat can start coming live, and we then have questions coming through that side.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, Brian. My observation is, I think it's an issue of leadership, or how cooperatives have been framed and been pushed within the South African policy and business context space. There's in one of my classes last year, I had the minister of the new minister then of small business development. And she was asked a similar question, but she was saying, no, we need to look at ways of pushing cooperatives because they're the easiest form of mobilizing economic participation for the majority. True that. But then the question was, but why are we not seeing that happening? And my thinking is probably because what we understand a cooperative to be tend to put a cooperative as public goods because it's on the basis of membership. And yet a cooperative is not public goods. It's actually a democratic business on the basis that it's meant to solve socioeconomic challenges of its members and its community. This is quite different from public goods where people, where it's okay for a state entity to fail, it's okay to give money to a department, it doesn't have to account. If we treat cooperatives as enterprises, which are democratically run, with the difference being they are not focused on profit, but they're focused on solving the socio-economic challenges which led to their founding. So if we change that, that debate and that argument and the framing of what cooperatives should be and are within the South African economy, it's not by coincidence that you look up at all these Western European countries. They have substantial percentages of their population are members of cooperatives. All your Scandinavians, none of them has got less than a quarter of its population in cooperatives. You know, there is value in it, but the way they've been framed, one of the examples which the minister was referring to was when she took over, she found out that in a 5-year period, that department had spent 5 billion funding cooperatives of one form or the other to do one thing or the other, but it could not be accounted for. And they could not effectively count and say, because there was no monitoring and evaluation. So that confirms my fear that we tend to treat cooperatives not as enterprises, but we treat them as public goods, just like another public entity, which we can go and take and no one is accountable. So people would form a cooperative, probably receive a grant and disappear.
There is one question I think that links very closely to what you have just raised, the success of most developed countries in having successful cooperative enterprises in relation to what we are seeing in our country. The question reads as follows: how do we run forward thinking and successful cooperatives on empty stomachs?
That's that.
Empty, how do we do that?
That's exactly the point, that we are thinking that empty stomachs are separated from the objectives of a cooperative. It is the reason that we are hungry, that we actually need to cooperate so that we can fill our stomachs. That's precisely the point here. It's not the other way around. Now that we know that we've got empty stomachs, the response now is, what do we do about that? Because this comes up with a three-phased approach. What is the problem? What are you doing about it? What works elsewhere and what works here that you can use to address that problem? So that we're hungry, now that all of us, we can tell that we are all hungry, the question is how do we get food? That's the historic reference, the prehistoric reference I gave right at the beginning, you say. That's how hunter-gatherers figured. We need to go and hunt collectively. If we're going to kill an elephant which can feed us for months, we need to, I can't do this as an individual. It's the same situation we are in. In crisis, we cooperate. Then we come up with better, effective solutions because we're social beings.
Colleagues, you are at liberty now to raise your questions. You can unmute yourself and then also raise it aloud to the doctor here to assist us in understanding these cooperative enterprises and the value of collective action, which we are really in need of if we really have to take off and begin to appropriate what is rightfully ours. Am I seeing any hand or there is a hand there? Yes. Let's see. Yeah, you can speak.
Yes, thank you. My name is Sipho Maluleke.
Hi, Sipho.
Mine is more of a comment and probably a challenge to all of us with regard to how to recruit and the challenges we face, and why do we have South Africans having some kind of a negative perspective with regard to cooperatives. At the dawn of democracy, there was a different BEE, which culminated into a number of people making a lot of money. Well, not a number of people, but a small number of people making a lot of money. where blacks were now allowed to, register and start companies, and those were presented as a platform where one can make a lot of money in a short space of time. And that gave birth to a lot of tenderpreneurs, not entrepreneurs. And today, when you speak about a cooperative, people tend to think it's not going to help me make money quickly. Number one. Number two, when you speak about a cooperative, and a few other people, I'm not sure, I haven't done a good research on this one, but there are those people who have been conned, people who have been scammed, where they were made to contribute money into whatever scheme, and that money disappeared. But very funny, for some reason, when a pyramid scheme comes on board, so many people jump on board rather.
Yes.
So I think the challenge we are facing is to answer the question, why do people fall for a scam easily, but they don't buy into a something like what we're talking about, where we have people coming together to form a cooperative? Why do we have people wanting to see results very quickly? Because I want to believe, Brian will attest and other members will attest, when GCI started, people were very active. But after a year or so, people started becoming reluctant in participation. People would still contribute money, but in participation, people would be reluctant. People would not come to meetings. Others would not send apologies. You'd have to put so much effort into at least getting an apology for a meeting. So I think this is the challenge we are facing. In your answer when Brian asked, I feel we need to find a way of, turning the mindset of South Africans in particular.
Right. Thanks,
No. A quick response there. I think that's why I went back and started with efficient and effective cooperative principles. And one of those principles is principle number 5 is about education and training and information, because there are a lot of quick win schemes out there. Number one, cooperatives are meant to be sustainable and long-term, and they are never designed for quick benefits to members, but to solve problems progressively and make members independent, autonomous and independent, both social and financial, but that cannot happen overnight. Unfortunately, we even have political talk which suggests that there is somewhere a pot of money which we can go collectively and take from. So there's a lot of misinformation. And you're quite right to say members in a cooperative might start participating less. That in itself is a violation of one of those principles I put in and saying, number 3, full membership economic participation. I am an entrepreneur. I will never have my money slip outside like a rural dog. My money, I observe it. I cannot put my money and hope that somebody else is going to look after my interest, no matter how small it is. Because I made a decision, I am going to put this small amount of money there. Then I must look up. And in a cooperative, that means full economic participation. The moment you have members not participating in the affairs of the cooperative, you are now missing the point. It's now losing its purpose. Those 7 principles: voluntary and open membership, democratic participation, membership, economic participation, autonomy, defending those rigorously. And focus here is probably, let's look up at education, training, and information. Come up with a strategy. How do we educate ourselves and membership to understand that this is not this is not a sprint, it's a marathon, and it's illogical for you to put up, no matter how small your capital is, then you expect someone else to manage it.
We have a question here, Doc. Say thank you for the presentation, Dr. Feels like being back at Fed's Business School. And the question starts, in the absence of leadership from government, how should we organize ourselves? How long before we should expect to feed empty stomachs? What method can be used to strengthen the monitoring and evaluation to improve trust in cooperatives?
Right. When you think of I think we give government too much credit or expectations, because there is a principle which I call threshold boundaries in terms of government. There is a certain capacity which is sitting up in government, but beyond that, we are expecting too much and we are being unreasonable. If you take, for example, I always use the example of our previous president as a case that we elected this president knowing very well what was his capacity. But then when he did not exceed that capacity, we started complaining. The same goes in cooperative. If we said this is the objective, then we owe it to ourselves to make sure who among us is best placed to guide us through this whole process, rather than best decisions on simple democratic rights which are enshrined in the organization. Democratic rights in such an organization should be to pursue the best interest of the organization. But if you're going to elect McEdward to lead an organization, McEdward has never led chickens, and you're expecting him to lead a corporation, a cooperative, it now means you're treating this cooperative as public goods rather than as an enterprise. Because leaders of an enterprise must clearly demonstrate capacity and bring value to that's why it's an enterprise. But when it's public goods, it's fine, it's just membership. We pay our tolls and all that. We lose money, so what? We come back and we hold the general meeting and we complain. But if we change that outlook and say, cooperatives are business. If I put 1 rand, I want to know what is that rand doing, and I want to make sure that that rand makes 10 cents next year. And beyond that, I also want to make sure that if I don't get 10 cents in actual 10 cents, I need to get value and service or goods which are worth that value. That's what cooperatives do. They are a serious business. In fact, they are more complex in their efficiency when it compared to your corporation, where you just have a team of executives and a few majority shareholders who make decisions. In this case, we need to look at being empowered. I don't think nobody across Africa, a lot of African countries, they know very well that the political class is not the one which is going to bring socioeconomic emancipation. This must be driven from ground up. And there's no better business model to do that than a cooperative, which is treated as an enterprise rather than as public goods.
Thank you. We had Mr. Dolph raising his hand. I'm not sure if he's still here.
I am. Can you hear me?
Oh, thanks, Mr. Dolph. Yes, we can hear you.
May I
ask a question?
I want to support Dr. McEdward. You know, the points that he raised, it's so important. I listened carefully and I can't but agree with him. And I want to comment at a certain stage to give some recommendations from my part when the time is appropriate and I must speak about it. I don't have a question at the moment except to support in what you are saying. Thank you.
Or then we'll give you an opportunity later, Mr. Dolph, to make a comment on that in that regard. We also had James and Lucy having raised their hand. Let's start with James, then Lucy will follow. Thank you, James. You can ask your question to Mr. Murimbika. If James is not there, Lucy, you can have an opportunity to ask your question now.
I just want to find out if we have organizations maybe that assist newly formed cooperatives, to get up and running. Again, I would also want to find out how cooperatives can be assisted to access land, to have access to land. Because here we are a newly formed cooperative, but we are in the rural areas. And, there now, I was happy with the question that was asked, as to why people, believe in pyramid schemes more than in cooperatives. What I've also noted is that people would want, to where they can reap rewards very, very quickly. But now here are people, us as a group, we are prepared to work. But unfortunately, in the rural areas, information is very, very scarce. You'll have to run around. The government, can also is also unable to assist that much because the officials do not, know that much. Now, I don't know any organizations to assist us, and also how can we access land? If there is anybody who knows how we can, we can get assistance in these two questions. Thank you.
Lucy is raising a very interesting point. When I mentioned the threshold boundaries, it's exactly what she's explaining, that you go to a local office to ask for information and they have no response. It's not because they're inefficient. Sometimes it's not inefficient at all. It's simply because they've reached their boundaries of threshold of knowledge which they can disseminate, which now requires who else from this network can provide us with adequate education, adequate training, and adequate information flow. And that can only happen when we participate effectively in networks. When you have more people, you can ask who are outside the organization, or outside your community, through all these social media. That's how the network effect works better. So to ask that, are they organizing? Ironically, the way the government is structured, particularly the small business development unit, it has got an entire unit on cooperatives, which actually takes a fifth of its budget to deal with cooperatives. An entire unit on cooperatives. That's first department. You go now to your agriculture, fisheries, and forestry, same. They have entire units which are dedicated to dealing with cooperatives. And yet the cooperatives which are actually being formed in the areas where the agriculture and all should be taking place, they have no access to these units. They have no access to this information. But the thinking behind the national government is it should filter through your district and to your local municipality. Then it's also captured within your economic, your local economic, your LEDs, and so. And in reality, this doesn't happen. You would find them in good written forms, but in reality, this is not happening, which means Lucy should be able to bypass those local structures and be able to lobby at the national level, where you would say, I am specifically lobbying because I failed to get service on 1, 2, 3. That's where the issue of voluntary participation comes in. You can't invest a lot of energy in it if you do not believe that you have to do it yourself. That's where the issue of membership economic participation comes in. You can't mobilize participation if the people you have grouped up with are looking for short-term goals, and they're thinking that it should happen, or they think somebody else is going to come and solve the problem. So Lucy is quite right that this is a bigger challenge. From my perspective, probably at some point, Brian, in a week or so, I would send you up these entities and these units one can follow in different locations and where one could lobby. Because the fact that cooperatives, the information about cooperatives is difficult to come by, requires organizations like yourself to lobby. Getting organized to lobby, because What is affecting you? It's not because there are no resources. The resources are there, but they're being misappropriated. They're being misappropriated because you do not have the political capacity to influence them to go to the right sector. That requires the beginning always to solve economic, social, and political issues. In this case, it's not about getting into office. It's ability to organize, ability to mobilize, and ability to lead. So this requires this group to also start thinking, how do we lobby for our interests so that we put this on the decision makers' agendas by sticking to those 7 principles I'm raising. So Lucy's problems are every cooperative. It seems even the funds which small business development puts in 5 years to 2019, imagine 5 billion was allocated as grants to all these business, to all these cooperatives, but not a single one produced a report which went back to the Department of Small Business Development. Why? Because they were never cooperatives. They were just entrepreneurial in going to siphon state resources and leaving Lucy of the world who actually want a solution dry. That requires us to be able to lobby as well to say, no, look, this is where we are. The same way we demand the right to vote, we must demand the same rights that we know the resources of the state. This country doesn't suffer from lack of resources. No. Every department of this country has got the best budget across any African country. You think of education, people like our Minister of Education, Njumi Cheka, controls a budget which is bigger than Uganda's national budget. She controls a bigger fiscus than Museveni, who is the president of Uganda. It's not an issue of lack of resources. It's just misappropriation. And we can't stop misappropriation by going into politics, but we can deal with it by lobbying.
James, you had your hand raised up. Over to you. You can raise your question to Dr. McEdward.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Prof.
Again.
It's good to hear your voice again. It's been a while. Yeah, I totally agree with you that, especially in the case of South Africa, we do have a bigger budget. The problem is that we have the problem of inevitable corruption or misappropriation of funds in these organizations. And I also totally agree with regards to that concept of threshold boundaries within this establishment. But also what I wanted to find is, not maybe diverting from the topic, I'm thinking that cooperatives have found a new home or new meaning in Stokvels. And why I'm saying Stokvels, if maybe I can steal 2 points from you as well, Professor. You mentioned stuff like, there's a network which is highly effective in terms of mobilization. So I think for me, why Stokvels are so effective, they're well organized, well mobilized, and there's leadership. And also it's so sentimental because the grouping within those Stokvels, as compared to cooperatives who are more of a formal structures. Even though the NCA does recognize Stokvels from a juristic entity perspective, I think working in a bank, I've seen from a savings and investment perspectives, whereby from a research and development, we're now looking at banking the Stokvels because there's a market share of about 50 billion or plus that is sitting there that needs to be explored. That every bank wants a slice of it. So I think going forward is a matter of then how do we ensure that we make these cooperatives sustainable? Is there a model that can a best practice model, maybe from an international perspective, that maybe our government can, or the Minister of Small and Medium Enterprise can adopt? People like yourself, Prof, are very influential, in this country. In that perspective, to say, look, we have seen we have done a study in the last 5-10 years in terms of cooperatives. I remember there was a time whereby the CIPC made a statement that we're no longer taking new cooperatives, so we have to go off the shelf, maybe I didn't get the reasons of why that was failing, why they have to defunct the cooperatives. But my suggestion is that there's an opportunity to do further studies and research to say, let's look at the best models to ensure that the cooperatives are sustainable, the funds are allocated appropriately across, and guys from, Alex, for instance, so that no one goes hungry, at night, etc. But yeah, I just wanted to make that distinction to say the stokvels versus the cooperatives. This seems like a new norm now. If you look at it. Thank you.
I think possibly before the doctor answers, I think we need to put stokvels and cooperative enterprise in context. I mean, majority of the James of these stokvels that are collecting on an annual basis the 50 billion plus. A week ago, we had that money sitting at about 60 billion now. That money gets used in December and January every year. Which is a challenge. And looking at or hearing from Dr. McEdward, one is able to see that our people, particularly those that are in the stokvel movement, rather than in the cooperative, yes, they are cooperating, but it's a short-term approach that does not seek to build sustainable cooperative enterprise. And that's where I think is principle number 4, the one of education and training comes in. How do we put efforts in going to the stokvels, educate them to become part of cooperative enterprises like ourselves as global change investors, where we are beginning to look at beyond what we are doing now, thinking of investment and intergenerational wealth creation in the space where we find ourselves in. But most people, the issue of pyramid scheme and 12 months approach seems to be the norm. And I think we'll ask the doc to put that in context and begin to get that to say, where are we failing as cooperative enterprises to get attention of these stokvels, because we are sitting there. Over to you, Doc.
Sorry, maybe just a quick one before the doctor gets in there. So that's why we need to, and I'm happy that I did the entrepreneurship course. We have to innovate, So I totally agree with you that the stokvel tendencies they tend to be once off, like an end of the year. So if you had to bank them from a financial service perspective, we need to look at things like how we can collateralize them. So what I mean by that, most of the stokvels, they have assets, they call it collective investment schemes. They buy properties, student accommodation, etc. So we can formalize them and provide some and make some sense of regulate them in the sense that we provide financial service solutions, and then they have to provide some sort of a collateral, in the form of assets that they might be owing instead of just cash, But but it's something that can be explored, I mean, if it holds a valid case.
Right.
Thanks.
Right. If you think of it, from a cooperative perspective, you ask a question: what are the challenges of stokvels? Right? They would collect all this capital, but the predominant issue they have there is consumption. It's collection, but with the primary objective of consumption at a certain point. So, if that is a problem, how do you then convince members that, in fact, we need to give you an ownership model which says you are the customers of the stokvel, but you're also the owners of the cooperative, right? What are the challenges within the cooperative? Solve the problems within stokvels from a cooperative perspective. Because the true competitive advantage of a cooperative is growing market share, as compared to the stokvel, which focuses, if I do not agree that we should be getting that at the end, then I'll not bother to join. But if I'm excited that within a year I'm going to get this, then I would join a stokvel. How do we convince people to say, okay, as a cooperative, our first priority is what is the long-term interest of this membership ahead of all these short-term goals. If we can do that, if we can convince people to join cooperatives on the basis that we are going to solve your long-term interest of you as a member ahead of organization's short-term financial interest. That's one principle of start selling cooperatives. Then you also look at the second one is cooperatives like Stockville's. They're dealing with people on the ground. So campaign on that basis that, look, yes, because nothing stops you as a cooperative to create a cooperative bank which is owned by a membership of 100 Stockvilles. Stockvilles become members of that cooperative, the banking cooperative, where you would get exactly another model of, say, let's collateralize and all. What stops Stockvilles from coming together in terms of interest and said, we can actually create a cooperative bank on this basis because we have the membership and we are on the ground with people and start solving problems in the same manner. Or what stops any cooperative to approach some of these organizations with the same interest, saying members first, right? This is a model which was used, for example, by if you go and check, there's one of the largest financial services entity in Singapore, NTUC or something, NTUC. They went through this whole process where they started losing market share because they were being cannibalized by members going to form certain consumeristic organizations, which can mirror the issue. We can mirror the South African Stockville in many ways. But the remaining members made a decision. They started thinking, okay, what is the challenge? And they said, okay, we solve things like short-term loans, long-term loans, insurance, and all that. So let's go back to those basics. Even if these members are members of those other consumer organizations, it doesn't mean that they no longer want insurance. It doesn't mean that they no longer want, it simply means they're stopping participation because they're no longer finding value. So we need to bring value back to them without telling them that you need to leave that. So when you look at South African context, you might actually think of, it's not an either or. We serve different interests. This might be short-term financial gains, but these ones are long-term and sustainable gains to a point where if we had stronger cooperatives, the whole issue of saying the economy is in trouble would not be as loud as we are, because the current level is thinking, where are we going to get money? Where are we going to get money? But if the value was sitting in communities with all of us having pieces and shares of it, the impact would be manageable. That's why a lot of these developed nations succeed, because what they put as value out there can be lost, but they never lose their collective, their collective value. That's why a majority, more than half of their populations, are members of a cooperative in one way or the other, regardless of all the other economic activities which they participate in. So there is room. It should not be an either or, but there is room to say what James was saying, that let's look up at a creative ways. Just like banks are looking at how do we access to manage their funds effectively. Cooperatives can do the same. How do we gain value and build value for members who are already members of Stockvilles? Nothing stops from Stockvilles themselves becoming members of a cooperative.
Thank you, Doc. There, Lisiwa is having his hand raised up. There's an issue, I think, from what Lucy raised earlier on. She never said in which part of South Africa is she coming from, because if we were to make a follow-up in assisting her in that area, we will need to know where she is, or if she has signed the attendance register. We have posted the link for the attendance register for everyone to sign, so that, I mean, even the info that the doctor had promised to share with us, then we can also be able to share with everyone who has participated in this conversation. Lisiba, over to you. Lisiba, are you there? Lisiba?
Okay, sorry, I was on mute. Hi, everyone. Good day, Doc.
Today.
It's been a very interesting session. I'm actually jumping from my office meeting to this one, and there's a couple of things that I've actually picked up, and from my own experience that I also want to highlight.
Yes, listen.
And the first and foremost is that from forming any cooperative and establishing it into an entity like you highlighted, first and foremost, it starts with the why. And I think you highlighted the why in the first place in your 7 principles. That in any, first of all, you need to understand why you do. If you're about to create a generational wealth, then instant gratification instantly falls away. And I think for any member and for any potential member that you want to recruit, they need to understand that from the onset, that if you are on about empowering yourself and the community and creating generational wealth, it's not about me getting the benefit today and tomorrow I'm driving a Ferrari or I'm living in Waterfall. That's something that we all need to agree on from the onset, and should be the principle that governs the cooperative.
Yes.
And secondly, one joining also comes with the level of trust. Me being part of GCI because I knew the pastor and I put my trust, and trust also has levels. And if you look at how the Stockfell models were always funded, it's always funded the principle of trust, because I know so and so. Hence, it was easy for them to circulate and borrow money amongst each other, because the funding principle also is about trust.
Yes.
Now, taking to a next level, now we're dealing with people whereby you want to bring them onto the cooperatives and you want to recruit. And based on what is currently happening, like someone highlighted earlier on, there's a lot of people that are being scammed out there that join this thing, there's a pyramid schemes, then the element of trust becomes critical. And where I actually started to have a bit of a challenge is that now, how do I get someone in? Because I know this thing, they need to trust me. But the level of trust with money is different with me trusting me as a personal person, whereby now they need to say, I'm going to put 250 into this, and I need to trust receiver that this 250, it won't be stolen. Yes. So one of the key principles you highlighted there was on autonomy. And one of the solutions I always remind is that, would it be possible for cooperative to partner with a well-established entity that has got a strong brand, but then are always caught between the level of keeping your autonomy and being partnered with a well-established entity that can help you to build the trust among the community or the society in general? Whereby if I go to someone and say, GCI is powered by ABSA or NetBank, those sort of things, but the challenge becomes the autonomy and how do you stand to main principles, because going out there to people, you need a point whereby they can use as a reference to say, okay, fine, because it's so and so, I can trust this. So taking this to a bigger scale, you need, I always say, feel that you need someone to help you as an engine, as a temporary basis, to literally give you a spark so that people can trust in what you're doing. But at the same time, is that how do you make sure you maintain your autonomy if you have to do that? That was my question ultimately. Right.
Okay. Yes, Lesibo. That's a very important observation and question. Remember, the thing is, you need to treat a cooperative as an enterprise, which means it is a business. The only difference from any other business is its pursuit of autonomy and independence and that democratic membership control. So partnering with an organization which furthers your agenda as a cooperative should not be a problem, as long as that partnership doesn't violate democratic membership. Remember, even in cooperatives, when you are voting, you don't vote on the basis that who put more money. You vote on the basis of principle of democracy, because it is the human beings who are more valuable than the funds or the amount you put in. So if you maintain that, as long as whoever you partner with does not come to usurp power to control and deciding who is a member and how much participation should an individual or a member should have, without threatening your independence in terms of autonomous decision making, you'll be fine to make any partnership, as long as whatever you do, craft it under those principles. This is a voluntary and open membership. Therefore, we partner with you. It should not take away the democratic right for us to decide whether the contract should be terminated or we should proceed. Of the voluntary right to say we need to get this one as a service provider versus this one. we should also understand that this is also a member economic participation, which means we have to defend our autonomy and independence regardless of how much value you as a service provider to us you're bringing in. So once you frame it precisely where you say, what is the objective? If that is very clear and you're starting from there, partnering with any organization or any partner or any individual who furthers the interest which observes this principle should be okay. But you can't do this on as you go, because that makes it a problem, because you're no longer sticking to principles, you're making them as you go. So right from the beginning, when you're saying, what do we want to achieve? Be honest to that. That's the driver.
Okay.
Then trust. The funny thing about trust is human beings, we are inherently selfish. Anyone who thinks that we are not selfish must go and ask human babies. Human babies, right from the day they are born, they are crying. They're not crying because they know that you are happy that you have a baby. They're crying because they're hungry or they want attention. It's full stop. And everything they're going to do is about attention to themselves. But they also know very well that as soon they will learn that they will not get anything they want without specific individuals providing that service. That's the issue of networking. So trust is built within the network. If I have my nucleus family, they put their own network, and all of us come to agree that this is a common interest, then we have a platform upon which we can exchange information and make decisions to join or not to join. But we are not running the campaigns. Even if we bring in an expert to help us, and we are failing in ourselves to observe the objectives we want to push, then trust will never be, because trust is earned. You don't demand it. So we need to act as such and demonstrate that we are trustworthy and we are honest to the objectives regardless of circumstances.
Thank you, Doc. We are getting closer. In fact, we have moved beyond our 16:30. I wanted to give an opportunity. I'm not sure if Sipo's hand is up because he had asked this question earlier, but Mr. Dorf had asked to make a comment before we close, which I think it will be an opportunity for him to make a comment. Then, Doc, you make also your comment. Then we can then close the conversation.
Thank you.
May I speak?
Yes, you can make that comment.
Thank you. Professor, thank you very much for your 7 principles that you have pointed out. I fully agree with them, and all 7 are necessary. I just want to say something about 1 or 2 things. The first one is the education and training. I think what we need is not only education and training within the community to open them for the cooperative, but also the education and training of the people employed by the cooperative, so that they are suitable for the need of their particular society. For instance, to assist a person starting a small business. I remember many years ago, I was a financial director of a consulting firm, and we provided electricity to a community in Natal. And the moment the electricity was available, all in a sudden, many small businesses started. One lady used it to sell cold drink because she has now the cooling system. The other one started a welding business. In other words, by having the opportunity and be involved with your community, you can do that. The other one is, why shall a cooperative be successful? Why must it be successful? The first one is, if you look strategically at it, they have certain very strong points. So use those strong points to attract the community, and then look what is the need from the community, and combine those two to market the cooperative. The cooperative must not pressure people to join the cooperative. It must attract people to join the cooperative. So a cooperative and these people not engage in the community itself on a daily basis, after hours, is not a cooperative. That's one of the examples of a cooperative, to be also, in addition to be providing the financial services, you must engage in your community. Show them this cooperative is participating in a particular community. I don't want to say, oh yes, one last thing, I think what is very important as well. A bank is not flexible. A bank has certain principles, is on national basis. A cooperative can be changed to accommodate the needs of a particular community without taking months to make those changes. So a cooperative has a very big advantage for each community. There's a lot of other things to say, but I don't want to take too much time of the business. Thank you very much for me to be present here.
Thank you, Mr. Dolph. It's worth mentioning that Mr. Dolph is a cooperator. He comes from another cooperative banking that is already registered. We are a prospective cooperative bank that is looking forward to registration. And that's one of the reasons he's also here, because of that principle number 6, cooperation amongst cooperators. Doc, over to you.
May I just say this? I've resigned from Oranje Kas end of September last year to give another person the opportunity. So if there's some way that I could help promote, do something for what we are talking about, I am available. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dolph.
What Mr. Dolph is saying that it's pretty, it must be crisp when you seek to cooperate with others. What value are you bringing where you stay? You cannot run a cooperative of people who are elsewhere, and there is no full participation of members. And network effect can only take effect if people are participating. Like the example you gave on electricity. You introduce electricity, suddenly down the road, so many little businesses are created. A welder comes in, a tire changer comes in, a hairdresser comes in by simply taking one economic act. That's what cooperatives do. They always become triggers of network effect. And if they are not triggering economic change within your communities, you're not a cooperative, because you are missing the principle 7, concern for community. If there's no concern for community, it's not a cooperative. So these cooperatives, I'm convinced that they are the most efficient way of economic empowerment, because it demands that members participate in solving their problems in their communities by maximizing their collective actions. That's where network effect would come in. And these are models which are evolving and come up with a long history of tested. Humanity does better when they cooperate than when we build walls. And cooperatives break down silos because they focus on community. And the community cannot live with one service. That if there's any lesson we need to take away, the cooperatives are better positioned to create effective network effect within the socio-economic development of communities than either the private or government. Even NGOs will not be able to solve some of the problems which our communities are facing, but cooperatives can, bringing back the actual economic power to individuals within those communities. Oh.
Colleagues, I think we are all appreciative of the input and the presentation that Dr. McEdward Murimbika has made. It has opened our ears and our eyes and our hearts. You know, I was also challenged by that Ephesians 6:12 that says there is no other spiritual wickedness that deprive, what is it? The majority economic minority. I wanted us possibly, how do we bring this concept that you have raised, like Edward, before you go, the majority economic minority, in the context, I mean, GCI, currently we are approaching 100 members, and we're looking forward to get to 200 members to be able to register as a cooperative financial institution. But this concept, the majority economic minority, in how we use that as an eye-opener and also as a platform or as a principle to rally around that one of member education and information, because I think that's where that principle or the issue that we have raised of the majority economic minority, where we find ourselves as South Africans suffering from. That, I think, if we're to deal with that in particular, for the majority to begin to accept that they cannot be the minority forever, there is something that can be done, and cooperative enterprise, cooperative banking, it can be a platform for financial and economic inclusion. How do we get that going? Possibly as your parting shot, thereafter then we can close.
You see, like what Dolph said, that when you think of education and the education and training I was referring to, it's not just about the communities themselves and the potential members. It's also this whole point of looking at who is currently in the cooperative. We're currently in the cooperative. Do we actually understand that we're having an agency with same principles? Let's take stock. Let's self-assess. Are we actually on the same page? Do we understand this to be the goal? And do we understand each other that this is where we want to go? When we look at those 100, it's now easier to go back now to the next 100, and introducing even more flexibility to start building more confidence for people to say, this is something I'm willing up to try, so that by the time they come in, others will come up for trial, but they must see that value, because you, as the old members, you would have demonstrated that we're trustworthy and we understand why we're here and we understand where we're trying to go. It's hard to recruit people to join up cooperatives because you're promising them long-term. You're not talking about short-term. And you cannot force people, because that's the one principle, that it must be voluntary. Because if you bring people in with certain promises, it's no longer voluntary. And when they don't get what they thought they were getting into, they become a problem to the organization itself. That's why cooperatives have lasted centuries elsewhere, because it's the understanding that we're here for the community and we're here for the long term. Make people understand. Do we understand that? And it makes it easier for us to campaign on those principles, because it's impossible. It can't be that we would reach a point where 25% of the population is dependent on welfare, and the other 25% is youth who have never worked, who can't work, they're no longer skilled. We have serious wicked problems which we can solve by cooperating. And why? How do we lobby that to be on the agenda rather than continuous false promise of so the struggle, like I was saying, it must be it's not just immediate flesh and blood here, but it's all about leadership. It's all about authorities. That's why Paul was talking of the darkness against spiritual wickedness and in the heavens, because everything is here. It's not that because the country does not have resources. It is here. But why are we not mobilizing those resources towards solving these wicked problems? That requires you guys to get your hands dirty, more than organizing the community, but also going into lobbying and empowerment.
Thank you, Doc, and thank you, colleagues, for taking your time in this busy schedule. We are looking forward to level 3 on the 1st of June, where I think much more interactions will be taking place. And from GCI, we are looking forward to seeing you on the 11th of June, because the next conversation that we are hoping to host will be on the 11th of June, It's more about elevating the status and the discussions around cooperative enterprises, cooperative banking, as a mechanism that can enable us deal with our socio-economic challenges, both during and post-COVID-19. That's why the more we begin to understand what cooperative enterprises and cooperative banking does in bringing about access to markets, access to financial services, the better. We are looking forward to meeting you on the 11th of June in the next conversation. And thank you, Dr. McEdward Murimbika, for coming so handy and talk to us around cooperative enterprises and the value of collective action. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
And I think the meeting is adjourned. The conversation is adjourned. Thank you, and let's meet next time on the 11th. Thank you, bye.